Before we start, just want to show you this forward-looking statement. If you're playing the forward-looking statement drinking game, have a swig now, but I'm guessing you're probably, if you are, you're not here anymore. But you've probably seen this all through Dreamforce, so I'm not going to talk about that. So, my name is Francis Pinder. I'm a technical architect consultant working in London, UK. I'm a freelancer, so I work with loads of companies, big and small, on implementation projects, post-implementation reviews, and org reviews, stuff like that. But we're here to talk about Salesforce Connect and custom extensions. So I thought I'd pull out what Salesforce says Salesforce Connect is. So Salesforce Connect provides seamless integration of data across system boundaries, letting your users view, report, search, modify data that's stored outside your Salesforce org. Now, I added in that report because end of the week, on our next release, we're actually going to be able to report on external objects, which is cool. But for me, this only tells you half the story of what you can do with Salesforce Connect. So I think it's a bit rubbish, but don't tell Salesforce. But I'm going to tell you more about that later on in the talk. So what is Salesforce Connect? So when it first released, it was called Lightning Connect. And then Salesforce realized they couldn't call everything Lightning, so they changed it to Salesforce Connect. But it's also known as external objects as well. And it went GA actually a couple of years ago in winter 15. And they've been kind of progressively elaborating and putting new features into it through every release. And it's kind of getting really good now. But I think of it as basically a tool to connect your external data sources into Salesforce without the data being persisted in Salesforce. So I think of it as basically like a window. You're kind of looking at your data through the window, but it's not actually stored in Salesforce. So when a user looks at that record in Salesforce, Salesforce does an immediate query out to that live data source to pull that record in and display it to the user. And if the user updates that record, again, immediately does a request out to that data source to update it. But it's not in Salesforce, which is really cool, because if you've got a data source with loads and loads of data in it, like your SAP with millions and millions of invoices in it, you only want to show those invoices, say, on the account record for those records that the user kind of goes to, which is kind of cool. There's a number of different ways you can use Salesforce Connect to connect to external data sources. So the first one is Salesforce to Salesforce. So I can connect my Salesforce org to another object in another Salesforce org and be able to query and update it and view it basically inside Salesforce. And the users don't even know that those records are not in Salesforce. Also, actually, with the Salesforce stuff, I wasn't going to say this, but I will anyway. You can basically use it as kind of like a star pattern, where you've got a Salesforce org in the middle, which has got your master data in it, and then you've got Salesforce orgs all the way around that kind of connecting up to that master org and viewing that data. But actually, that data source in the middle could also be an OData compatible data source. So either OData 2 or OData 4, which we'll come to in the next slide. Simple URL, which is basically just a JSON, consuming JSON. And then also what we're going to talk to a lot more today about is custom Apex extensions, where it's where we're creating Apex code to talk to potentially an endpoint on the internet that isn't OData compatible, that doesn't support everything we need to pull that data in and get that represented as objects within Salesforce or external objects within Salesforce. So what kind of data sources could you be supported using OData 2 and 4? There's a load of stuff. SQL Server, Dynamics, Azure, as I said, kind of SAP as well, if you're pulling invoices in. But also there's loads of partners that are using it now. Say Jitterbit, Informatica, where you've got integrations, custom integrations, and they just kind of translate that into OData and allow you to kind of view it within Salesforce. But actually, what I kind of used it for initially was to solve a bit of a problem for me. And that was when my family came round for dinner, it was a flipping nightmare. Because basically, there was so many dietary needs, it was nuts. Basically, nut allergies, we had shellfish allergies, we had all kinds of stuff. And trying to find recipes that actually kind of fit the needs of everybody was really annoying. So basically, I came up with created an Apex connector to an endpoint that basically had about 1.6 million recipes in it and allowed me to filter based on dietary needs. So for example, this is my Salesforce org, and I just basically typed chicken in my search, and it's basically come back with a load of recipes. So we've got Martha Stewart there, Bon Appetit, and these are all being indexed from recipe sites on the internet, and this company has kind of boiled it all down to an API that I can just call, which is really cool. And then so, for example, grilled devil's chicken under a brick sounds really cool, so I'm going to select that. And here I've got the record. So I've got, the image, and these are all basically the fields from this endpoint. I've got the ingredients, I've got actually the Martha Stewart link. I've got all those health labels that I can now, report on in Salesforce. So egg-free, soy-free, shellfish-free. That sounds kind of cool. I've got my ingredients. I even got my health, nutrition information on those recipes. But I kind of didn't round these up for a purpose because essentially this is Apex. So I could have rounded those figures up if I wanted to. But if you're using OData, basically, you can't transform that data coming into Salesforce. So you're kind of at the mercy of the endpoint. Now, if it was SQL Server, you could put views in there and talk to the views and do some transformation there. But because I'm using an Apex connector, I could round those values up if I wanted to, which is, kind of cool. And this is the endpoint I use, Enderman, which, to pull all this recipe data out, which is really cool. But before I dive into the code, let's just take a step back and just go through the declarative steps really quickly. So the first thing to do is the on-premise setup. Now, you're talking to, if you're talking to a database internally, you've got to basically change your firewall rules and bash it out onto the internet so it's visible to Salesforce in the first instance, which may take a long time or may not. And then we start setting up our data source connection in Salesforce, which is setting the definition of our external data source and what it supports. Then I do a sync, which is essentially saying, what are all the tables and fields from that external data source? Don't worry, we'll go through all this. It's all good. I select my external objects that I want, and then Salesforce creates those within Salesforce, and then I do all that standard configuration that you'd normally do. So page layouts, linking the object to other objects in Salesforce, either other external objects or in normal objects. So quickly dive in and go through setting up this. So just, if you use this is Lightning, but if you're using Classic, it's all the same pretty much. Just search for external in the setup. So either pressing the cog and going in setup, or in the Classic UI, your name and setup. And then we've got external data sources and external objects. So select external data sources, and you get this page coming up, and then you just want to create a new external data source. So this is my external data source, and you can see it's got a couple of options. We've got OData 2 for the cross-org, which is the Salesforce to Salesforce, and a simple URL. Now, if I had created my Apex connector, which we'll get to in a bit, it'll appear in here as well, because I'm extending the provider, but we'll get to that in a bit. It's all good. So, but then so I'm going to select OData 4. Now, who's heard of the Northwind database? Yes, classic database. So if you had Microsoft Access, it got bundled with Microsoft Access back in the long time ago. And anyway, Salesforce has basically put the database on the internet and put an OData 4 endpoint, which anybody can use, which is really cool to test this stuff. And so basically, I've just put that URL in, and it's anonymous authentication, so you can just access it. But I just wanted to go through some of these fields. Now, when we set up our provider class, which we will in a bit, we basically can control some of these fields and what they display, depending on what our endpoint supports. So, for example, the connection timeout, we can say if that URL should be there, the user should be asked for a URL or not. We've got the connection timeout. We can say if it's writable, this external object or not. There's high data volume, which I now have to apologize to you, because I did say at the beginning that Salesforce doesn't store any data in Salesforce, which isn't actually 100% correct. So basically, what Salesforce does is when I query that record in Salesforce, like that chicken record, Salesforce goes, OK, I haven't queried this record before. It goes off to that external, well, when it searches that external data source and brings that record in, And then at that point, it will create a Salesforce ID inside Salesforce and match that against the foreign key or the external ID of that record. So but that's the only data it stores. So it's your external ID or foreign key and a Salesforce ID. And this basically allows Salesforce to be compatible, that record to be compatible with pretty much everything else in Salesforce. So when you're on a list view and you know it's got the recent items on there, Salesforce has got to store those, which are the recent items somewhere. And it basically, that's what it uses that kind of ID for. It's being able to link that record to other records in Salesforce. But if you click this button, it switches that off. So it doesn't create that Salesforce ID. And why is that important? It basically means there's a limit in Salesforce to the number of records that it will kind of pull in from your external data source. And that's 50,000 records in an hour period. But that's not every single time it queries the same record. It's just when he queries that once and creates this Salesforce ID. But if you tick this box, it will switch that off and won't create that Salesforce ID, and it will take away that limit. So you can query as much data as you like, but things kind of stop working. So like the list view and things like that, Salesforce 1. But if you say you kind of use this for, say if you've got share information and you want to, in Salesforce, you want to do a SOCL query to your external object, which then pulls in that share price at that point in time. You consume that price and go off and do the rest. You don't want to do anything else with the record, but that operation is happening again and again and again and again. Then you can set that as high data and you won't get hit by the limits. Also, if you've got a device that's doing a random number generator, that's true random number generator device within your company, and you want to hook up to that, you can. Again, you're not storing it, you're not interacting with that data. I won't go into this too much detail. There is authentication as well. So anonymous authentication, which I said, which is basically for the north wind. Also, there's named principals, so you can set up a specific account that's connecting to your endpoint, but also OData, also OAuth authentication. So users can actually connect using OAuth to your external data source, and so they're actually reading the data using the same permissions as they have in that data source when they access the data in Salesforce, which is kind of cool. Okay, so I click save on that. I get this, and then I get the validate and sync button that I need to click. And this, again, we're basically going to implement in the code. And this is basically saying, OK, go off to that endpoint and pull back all those tables and all those fields that are available to in the endpoint. And so this is all the stuff that comes out of Northwind. I'm going to select orders and order details. And then I'm going to hit sync. And then Salesforce basically creates the metadata in Salesforce for those objects. So it's basically as if you'd created a custom object, basically. So if we click into orders, it looks very similar, just like a custom object, pretty much. We got this display URL and external ID, which is standard required fields. And then we have these custom fields that it's created off the back of that endpoint. You'll see also we've got the table name and external data source. So this basically is your link back to your data source. So that allows you to kind of change the API name and the labels on here without it kind of affecting your data source connection. But also you'll see it says __x. So it's basically saying this is an external object. So rather than __C for a custom object. Also there you'll see enable reports, which is really awesome. So I can report on this object if I wanted to, if I click that tick. And also development status, make sure it's not in development, like I did, because I'm silly. But anyway, so then what I'm going to do is dive into the customer ID quickly. Here's the customer ID. And then you'll see there's some extra fields on this as well. So there's filtering disabled, sorting disabled, is name field, stuff like that. Now, this is quite important when we're implementing our Apex code, because that endpoint you're communicating with may not be compatible with doing filtering, doing sorting. Yeah, it just may not be available. And actually, some of the Endemol, the food APIs, there were some fields I just couldn't search on or filter on. I can either do this programmatically or in the UI, basically say this field cannot be filtered on. Yep, we're just going to disable that. So that's cool. But this customer ID is, at the moment, is just that foreign key, basically. of the customer. And it's not related to any of my objects in Salesforce, so I'm going to quickly click Edit, change field type, as you know, probably everybody's done. And you'll see there's a couple of different relationships there. There is no master detail, so you can't cascade security down and things like that. But we do have indirect lookup and external lookups. So external lookup is basically when you want to relate this object to another external object within Salesforce. And an indirect lookup is when I want to change this field to basically look up to a custom object or a standard object in Salesforce. So I'm going to look up to the contacts or accounts. I can't even remember what I did, but that's doing an indirect lookup. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to select the account. And I'm going to set my target field on the account. So this is the external ID on the account that is my foreign key from the data that's coming from the data source. So this has to be unique and an external ID, otherwise it won't appear in here. So I've selected that, click Next. All good, that's good. Click Save, and voila, I've now made that lookup to that object. So now I can basically show all these orders on my account object in the related list, or they can search for it and stuff like that. So, and then you can start doing page layout stuff and loads of other stuff as well. But I'm not going to go into more detail because you know all that stuff anyway. So, but this is all the stuff it basically supports. List views, data views, chatter feeds, SOQL queries, SOSL queries, DML, updating, and yeah, all the standard stuff, Lightning, but some stuff it doesn't. So the next slide is really the important slide, which is all the stuff, hopefully, next. Yes, it doesn't support. Which a lot of this kind of makes sense because the data isn't in Salesforce. You know, it can't do a roll-up summary. You know, it doesn't know when the data changes. Field history tracking, again, doesn't know when the records change in this external database. Notes and attachments, I don't know. Formula fields, bit of annoying. I can understand if it's a formula field that's cross objects and stuff like that, but a formula field just on the object would be really nice, Salesforce, if it's contained within that object. But also, roll-up summary fields, approvals, process builders, triggers at the moment. But what's coming in this release is external objects for communities, custom reports, which is really awesome, feed-based laters, but also, I've been told, safe harbor, support for triggers, which will be really awesome. So then when that record, because OData 4 supports the notification of updates, deletes, creates within your external data source to another OData data source. So Salesforce can basically listen to those events and then fire the triggers based on that external data source. But I don't know, rumors, I have no confirmation, but that would be really cool. OK, so now let's get on to the good stuff of creating this Apex connector. So the first thing I do whenever I do kind of implementation work, check the documentation and check out the limits. Here, it's all, maximum external objects per org, 100, maximum joins per query across external objects, 4, that all sounds good. Maximum rows retrieved per hour, we talked about this is the 50,000 limit per hour, which of course gets, if you switch, doesn't apply for the high data volume, which is cool. And then the other one is basically my OData query size. But that, to me, looks all cool, nothing really to worry about. So let's get diving into some code. So the first two, you need to basically implement 2 classes. The first one is the Datasource Provider. Now, this is basically your definition of that endpoint. It's basically saying what is its capabilities? What is the authentication capabilities? Does it support OAuth, basic, anonymous, or certificates, or one or many of those? And also then, what is the capabilities of that data source? Can I do queries? Can I create records? Can I update records? Can I delete records? But also, it's got quite powerful pagination capabilities, because pagination can be implemented in a million different ways. And so you kind of want to handle that kind of pagination in quite detailed form in your code. OK, so let's dive into a bit of code for this data source provider. So this is actually some code from Salesforce, actually. This basically does a loop back into Salesforce and queries Salesforce again. But you can see here, I've extended the data source provider in a global class. It could be public as well if you wanted. And I basically override the get authentication capabilities. And this is where I basically say, what does it support? And I'm just saying anonymous because I'm looping back into Salesforce. I'm just using the user's execution permissions, or the user's permissions. So that is all good. And then you just return capabilities. So pretty easy. Then we got the get capabilities. So this is my data source, row queries. Does it support row queries, creates, updates, deletes, search, and this pagination. And then again, return those capabilities. And finally, the factory method that creates my data source connection class, which we'll go to next. So that's it, basically. So all it is, then that's set up my provider. Set all the capabilities, all good. OK, so data source connection is basically what we do when a user does a search or does a query or does an update on that data. But also, we've got this sync method at the top. Now, it's exactly the same, essentially, as when the user hits that sync button that we did earlier. It's basically that, tell me what the structure is of your data source. Tell me all the tables and all those columns within it. And also, for each of the queries, search, upsert, and delete rows, delete methods, we have this basically context that gets passed through, which is basically all the information that you need to say, OK, what have they searched on? What is the filter? And whatever everything is. And I'm just going to dump this out, because it kind of puts it in a bit more context of what you've got to do when you override these methods. My clicker works. OK, so this is basically just the query context I've dumped out. And basically, this is you need to kind of go through this and consume this information so that you can query that external data source. So at the top, we've got the query more, the kind of pagination fields. Then we've got the table selection. So what columns are the user actually selecting? So if you're on kind of like they're on their list view, and the columns that are displayed, all the columns will come in here. But also you've got that aggregation. So is it an aggregation query that they're doing, counting up the records and things like that? So you kind of need to adjust for that. And then also a list of all the filters. So all the different filters that they have applied. Now, this really comes into effect when they start using reporting and filtering, but also list views and things like that. So here you can see that I've just done a search at the top of the screen like I did earlier, tapped in chicken, and it's basically searching on the recipes table. And the type of that query is basically a contains query. So that could be does not contain, equal to, not equal to. Again, you need to kind of handle that kind of stuff. If you have that field enabled as filterable, of course. And also, the table selected and the ordering of the data. OK, so now I've described that, you kind of know what you need to implement in these methods. So this is the data source connection. So the first, so this is just a REST resource. So I created a REST resource that basically, this is a REST resource that bounces out and comes back into Salesforce to do these actions within Salesforce. And so the first method to override is the sync method, which I mentioned earlier. And this is, here's my table, and these are all my columns in it. Now, I've hard-coded it, but of course, if you don't want to dynamically create it, you can go off, dynamically pull those columns in and build up these data source tables and columns, and then return that data set. All good. Then we start implementing the other methods, so the querying. So when I query this record, what am I going to return? And then consume that query context like we showed before. What am I going to do with it? So this is basically, again, just in Salesforce, doing a query on that record. Or if it's a query more tokens there, it's going to query the next set of data. Again, this is kind of up to whatever your data set, your data source supports. Then we've got search. So if they do a search, upsert rows. So again, this is if they upsert the rows, go off, build that up for the updating of the account, do the JSON call, return the results, if you get an error or not. And then right at the bottom, there's delete rows as well. Does that all make sense? Hopefully. Yeah? Cool. OK, but as I said earlier, Salesforce basically says that this is what the definition of the Salesforce Connect is. Salesforce Connect provides seamless integration of access across system boundaries, letting your users view, report, search, and modify the data that's stored outside your Salesforce org. But it's Apex, yeah? Why does it have to be an external data source? Why can't I just query stuff inside the Salesforce org, yeah? And it's now supporting reports. So why can't I just give all my admins a list of all my deleted accounts that happened yesterday? Because it's Apex, I can query all deleted records, can't I? So here we go. I've just created a report that I deleted the radnitmock.com, my website, and it's now appeared in the report. That's not what you can't do that in standard reporting. What about another? The next one is quite, there's a lot of IDs in here, but essentially you can translate this out. But this is the sharing objects in Salesforce. I can give access to my admins to the manual sharing rules, so they can audit when users create manual sharing rules on objects, and what the hell have you done there? And it supports chatter and stuff like that, so they can chatter out, what have you done? What are you doing? So yeah, it's really cool. So don't think it's just outside Salesforce. Think inside Salesforce as well. So accessing of objects that we just mentioned, like sharing objects that aren't accessible to the Salesforce, accessing hidden fields like is deleted, stuff like that. But also custom data joins, essentially. You are at the mercy of Apex still. You've still got those Apex rules, query limits and stuff like that. But if you do have objects you want to kind of join together that aren't obvious and can't be used in reporting, then you can. And kind of hybrid objects, which I thought was a good idea, which is not anymore. But you are at the mercy of Apex limits. So when you're creating this Apex connector. So, maximum callouts, 2 megs, the 120 millisecond timeout, which again, you consider if you're doing these complex queries to that external data source, how long is it actually going to take? Report rows, when the report is only just, coming out this weekend, hopefully, only returns 2,000 records at the moment, no master detail, and yeah, you're at the mercy of that endpoint, and what it supports. If you can't search, if you can't filter on those rows, then, you can't support that. But, we've shown that you can handle that kind of stuff within there. Some other considerations. Don't forget to put your remote site settings, the endpoint in your remote site settings, or Salesforce just won't find it. If you are doing OAuth, you can throw the OAuth token expired exception that forces basically the refresh of the token. But also, if you're doing DML, you can't use just the regular insert update of the DML. Because it's an external data source, you've got to do all DML asynchronously. So you've got to do Datasource insert async, which is a new method, to update that data in that external data source so that the transaction can continue. And then at the end, you can, if you want to later on, you can basically call the async, get async results, and return the result data back to you. And the external ID field must be unique. Now, I didn't mention, I will whiz back, because I forgot to mention in the code, there is a couple more parameters that you can do. So in these fields, I mentioned about the you can't filter, you want a more defined data type. You can actually, there's got extra parameters in like the data source column to basically say this field is not searchable, this field is not filterable, this field is not searchable, which is where you kind of define it in the code for that if you don't want to get the users to do it. Yes, but that is that. And then finally, there is here it is. There is other partners out there that actually support OData as well. So if you find Salesforce OData is not great for you, then Squid do it as well. So they basically can connect to OData data source as well, and they can graphically make it look really cool UI. Also, there's Salesforce Connect on Trailhead, which has got some great modules on that for using connecting. There's also a mini hack, if you haven't done those. Mini hack 2 is the Salesforce Connect mini hack, which again, you can kind of do something similar to what I did earlier on. And that is about it. So is there any questions? I think I've got about 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you did an anonymous
Yeah, so the anonymous I use, because it's bad wording for the Apex connector in relation to data within Salesforce, because the user is executing essentially that. It maintains the user's context. So when you do, if you want to just query the records they've got access to, or then it'll only return those records. So the anonymous is a bit. It doesn't really work for being inside the org. So you don't need to do any authentication if you're just accessing people inside the org. Yep. Yeah, so this is an extra cost to the fee. Yeah, and when it came out, it was a lot. It has come down in price, but I don't know what it is now, the price of it. Hence, there is Squid and other tools as well that you could use if you wanted, that are cheaper offerings. I don't know, it might be cheaper now, but it is an extra offering. But in your developer org, you do get one data source connection free. So you can develop stuff in your dev sandbox, but then, you just can't use it in your production. Yeah, invoices are the classic, yeah. So the limitations around, doing the query, was that 50,000. So that was basically, if you haven't queried those records before, you can only query up to 50,000 in an hour period. But if they have already been, they're not included in that. Other limits. There's the query. So when you're doing the reporting and you're connecting to an external data source and mashing that with opportunities or whatever in Salesforce, obviously you're waiting for that external data source to return data. So you've still got the 120-second response time limit, but the reporting may obviously slow down because you're calling this external data source. So that could time out essentially. But the stuff I've done, I haven't noticed it really. But the 50K is probably the biggest limit for it. Everything else is, Cool. Any other questions? I've had my coffee now, so it's great. And thank you so much for coming at 8:30 in the morning.